Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Because I can't see you. Can you do something with this? No? All right. In 2010, I think late 2010, I was approached by Professor Yitzhak Ben Israel. He's a former Army officer, Air Force officer who also served occasionally as a scientific advisor to prime ministers. And he said to me, I want you to read a novel. I said, I don't read novels. I read history, biographies, books on economics, technology, things like that. He said, no, you want to read this novel. And he gave me a book by a Jewish French writer by the name of Guy Philippe Goldstein. It's called, what is it called? Babel, like Babylon, Minute Zero. It was a fictional book about a future cyber war between the United States and China. To me, it didn't seem that fictional. And I read it. I called him the next morning. I said, I read the book. He said, you read the book? Yeah, I said all night, and I read this book. It's a novel, he said. No, it's not a novel. It's a description of coming reality. And I didn't sleep all night, not only because I read the book, but because I understood the implications for Israel, for any country. We couldn't be left defenseless in this developing world, in the cyber world. I gathered Professor Ben Israel and my former military secretary, General Locher, and I said, I want you to set up a steering committee to set up cyber defenses for Israel. And we then appointed Eviatar Matanya. Eviatar is here. Are you? Stand up, maybe? Yeah, go ahead. That's him. I think you just wrote a book with Amir Rappaport, who was here on the stage, called Cybermania. Cybermania or Cyber Money? Whatever. But I asked Eviatar to head the National Cyber Defense Board. And we had to approach this question. How do you deal with cyber? Now, obviously, there are questions of offense, there are questions of defense. And I won't get into the questions of offense, but I'll ask about defense. If you want to defend the attackers, military intelligence, Mossad, Shin Bet, you want to defend them, well, that's pretty easy. You defend them. Put a fence around them. But how do you put a fence around the cleaning company that sweeps their offices, or the medical company that treats their personnel, and so on and so on and so on? Where do you draw the line? These were very complex questions. Do you force companies to join certain cyber defense requirements? Do you do it on a voluntary basis? Where do you draw the line? 100 questions, 1,000 questions. No one knew. Each of the leading countries looked around their shoulders to the other one to say, what do you do? Nobody knows. So what do you do when nobody knows? Do you know what you do? No? If any of you have been in the army, at least in our army, you have vehicles scattered in the field aimlessly, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and so on. And what you have to do is the commander decides on a certain direction, which is the plausible direction, and he says, everybody fall in line. You fall in line as you move. So we move forward, and we set up the National Cyber Board. Eviatar did that with great skill. And we set up other adjacent things. We divided the money, solved the turf war. That's the biggest war. Turf war between the various intelligence agencies, who does what, who doesn't do what do they do together, and set up also requirements and guidelines for our civilian defense. Now, it's important to understand, cyber, I'll talk about offense first. Cyber war is like the introduction, roughly like the introduction of the Air Force in World War I. So before that, you had land war, you had naval war, but the addition of the air war created a new dimension in warfare. Unfortunately, we see it now. I'll talk about that in a minute. But that was one component. And you needed not merely new forces, you needed a new doctrine. What is the doctrine? And just as we had to work out through a lot of concepts, and a lot of intellectual rigor was invested in trying to figure out what is the right way to deal with offense and what is the right way to deal with defense. And as you well know, the two are combined. The best defender is the best attacker. And the best attacker is the best defender. So we had to work this out, and it's never ending. But we just plunged ahead, set up the various institutions, set up a place also in Beersheba, which helped the town develop, and began to move in these things. Now, here's what happened. Obviously, everything that we did was based on a goal. And the goal was to make a goal which I set in 2012, that within 5 years, Israel becomes one of the 5 leading cyber powers in the world. That wasn't really accepted because at the time people didn't understand why cyber was important. So I remember that I was in a Knesset debate and one of my chief opponents said, look at the prime minister, he's talking about cyber again. He's talking about cyber again. You know, virtual reality. This is a virtual prime minister. He's talking about cyber again. I sure did. We had to. But this was based on the question of security. How to defend the country in this new world. The result was not merely security. The result was a tremendous economic opportunity, which our entrepreneurs, and we have many identified immediately, and we're already working in. But there was an enormous boost the minute we started to invest in these areas, and we invested a lot, including in such things as creating programs for kids, for high school kids, changing departments. What are the skills that we need? How early can we get them? Can we identify the brightest minds? Can we move them into that direction? The market would do that anyway later, but we wanted to be ahead of the market. This created an enormous economic opportunity with hundreds and hundreds of startups that you're familiar with. You may be meeting some of them here in this room, in order to create a new industry. And this industry has an enormous, enormous advantage. You're in the right business. It's an endless business because in the digital economy, everything, but everything, needs cyber defense. Everything. There is no end to this. So you're definitely in the right business, and it's still a growth business. It's just beginning even. So this is something that we began to develop, and when we began to develop that, there were 2 basic limitations that we hit very quickly. The first one was the natural desire for, not for regulation, but for over-regulation. And if you over-regulate something, you choke it. It's a big problem. So we had to, I had to fight the tendency for over-regulation. The most important regulation was to protect the civil liberties of citizens against advanced spyware. That, by the way, doesn't work so much, as you can see. I'll give you a personal testimony later. It's a real problem. That's a real problem. And I often said that. I said, you cannot use advanced spyware against your citizens. You cannot do that. You should not do that. You have to have enormously extreme situations where you do that, and you have to guard the civil liberties of your citizens because we live in democracies and we want to protect the civil liberties of our citizens. But we didn't have to over-regulate that because it was illegal anyway to use it. The problem there is not the legislation, the problem there is enforcement of legislation. And that is something that must be done all the time. The second problem was personnel. You need qualified personnel. And demand for Israeli high-tech was outstripping the supply. And there were 2 ways to deal with that. The first was to bring outsiders in. And we created a structure of fellowships. It's very hard to put labor inside Israel for a variety of reasons. But I thought that importing this labor, this skilled labor, was like bringing yeast to the dough. It's you know Thai restaurants? Israelis love Thai food, okay? So if I want to make a Thai restaurant in Israel and I want to give employment to people and I import a Thai chef, I've just taken out an Israeli chef from business, right? Wrong. Wrong. I just created jobs for 20 Israelis because a good Thai chef brings the business higher, okay? The same thing here. If we can bring qualified people into Israel, they could help sustain the business and also create obvious extensions for Israeli companies abroad. That's one thing we did. The second thing was absolutely to encourage the companies to do what they were going to do anyway, which is to go to Cyprus or to go to Eastern Europe or to go elsewhere to get the programmers and the other people that they need to expand the business. By 2017, Israel was second in the world in the number of deals. In 2010, I think we had about $60 million, something like that, worth of cyber investments. By 2021, it was $9 billion. It is, I think, just short of the United States, but very little. This is one case where Israel, which is 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, is not merely per capita in the highest places. In absolute terms, we're almost at the top, which tells you there's a great opportunity here. That opportunity increases all the time because of the development of the digital economy, which I mentioned. Unfortunately, it's not only the digital economy that we see cyber in. We see cyber warfare right now in the tragic events that are unfolding around Ukraine and beyond. I think everything should be done and every effort should be made to stop the tragedy and to stop the bloodshed. We in Israel obviously have a personal, not a personal, but a specific vested value in helping the Jews of Ukraine, those who want to make Aliyah to Israel, be able to do so. That is to come to Israel, which is the homeland of all the Jewish people. In addition, I fully support giving short-term visas, or as long as is necessary, for non-Jews in Ukraine who want to find refuge in Israel. But equally, there's another problem that faces the Israeli entrepreneurs in this room and faces all our high-tech industry, cyber and beyond. We have now tens of thousands of programmers in the Ukraine. Tens of thousands, some say it is up to 50,000. If we don't find a solution to that problem, and until we find a replacement to that, to those personnel, Israeli high-tech and the cyber with it will hit a brick wall. So we have to find a solution to that. And the best solution is to include in the people that we offer visas and refuge in, these particular people, in addition to the others that I mentioned. And of course, an alternative would be to have neighboring countries like Poland or Bulgaria or Romania to make international arrangements to have these people stay there and continue to work for us. The main problem, the main choke point for Israeli cyber is personnel. The ability to make joint ventures with companies that are represented here, with people, gifted people in your own countries, I think is one of the, not only one of the solutions to our problem, but also a great opportunity for you, because I think Israel is unmatched. It's unmatched, and people often ask me, I was in China, and they brought me to this college where they nurture the up-and-coming leaders of China, which mostly come from the bureaucracy. And they asked me, as I was asked in many other places, so what's Israel's secret? What is Israel's secret? What's the secret recipe? Because Israel is, as I said, it's 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, but the University of Pennsylvania conducts an annual poll with 20,000 opinion leaders in many, many countries, And since 2015, Israel is ranked the 8th most powerful country in the world. I'm not sure that's correct. And I don't know if we're 8th or 10th or 12th, but I do know this. I know that all the countries ahead of us are enormously bigger than us. Some have more than 1 billion people, some have hundreds of millions of people, and so on. And all the countries after us are in that same category. So what is Israel's secret? Well, one of the secrets is obviously the growth of an ingenious and creative entrepreneurial economy. And so they asked me, how do you do that? And I said, well, it's like this. You throw in a hefty dose of free market reforms, and we made an enormous number of free market reforms, enormous. Beginning in '96, when I liberated the currency, you couldn't take foreign currency out of this country. You couldn't. If you took out more than a few $1,000s, you'd be brought to trial. Dozens and dozens and dozens of free market reforms. So you take a hefty dose of free market reforms, you mix in a hefty dose of investments in military technology, especially intelligence, military intelligence, and then you take the country, you shrink your country to a very small size so everybody meets everybody, because even in the high-tech world, there's a priority on people actually seeing one another and talking to one another. I don't know if you know that in your business. Still important. Still important. And the last thing is you throw in an ancient culture that is always questioning and never satisfied with the status quo. If you mix it all together in a pot, you get Israel, more or less. This is why I think you're in the right place. There are vast opportunities, vast challenges, vast power, but with power comes responsibility. And I urge you to continue to exploit the opportunities and always remember your responsibilities. Thank you.